Hello, everybody, and welcome to the NextGen Planners podcast. My name is Dan, and I'm the head of community experience here at NextGen Planners. And today, I am very, very happy to be joined all the way from the United States of America by Dr. Mary Bell Carlson. How are you doing today, Mary?
Hi, well, thank you, Dan. It's good to see you.
You too. Thank you so much for this. It's been a few years now since we've been introduced, and you've been a speaker at one of our conferences, which was amazing. But it's great to have you on the show today to have a chat about something that we're all passionate about here at NextGen, and you are as well. So, thank you so much for joining us. So, for anyone who doesn't know Mary, she is a financial behavior expert, speaker, and author from the Financial Behavior Keynote Group in the United States. So I always avoid introducing people and telling the audience what you get up to on a daily basis because I'll probably get it wrong. So, Mary, to kick us off, can you tell us what you get up to on a daily basis?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. I do a couple of different things. First off, I run something new that we just started last year. It's called the Financial Behavior Keynote Group. And this is a group of evidence-based practitioners and researchers that really translate that discussion from the research world into practice. And so we have speakers, we have consultants, and we do all kinds of events from everything from webinars to in-person events and have a variety of speakers. And we just added a CEU component. So if you're looking for continuing education anywhere in the world, it's all webinar based. So you're welcome to jump on and get your CEUs through us. We offer CEUs for both the Certified Financial Planner designation and the Accredited Financial Counselor designation at this time, looking to grow that. So that's what I do in the day. And then I also teach at a couple of universities here in America, University of Georgia and Texas Tech in their financial planning program.
Very exciting stuff. So I think obviously with the name of your group that you've started there, financial behavior, it's obviously a big topic in financial planning at the moment. A lot of people are talking about it. A lot of people are very excited about it, and in a way, it's always been there. Is this the need to look at the psychology of the person that you're actually working with as a financial planner? But I think you would agree, Mary, that for many, 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 many years, we've looked at financial planning backwards. So we've often started with the products and the investments and the things, the tools, and we've forgotten really about the person on the other end of the table. Now, in recent years, it's coming up and we're starting to almost have an epiphany and realizing, oh, actually, you can have a lot more impact on someone if you focus on them first rather than the products and the tools first, which is great, obviously. But this is a huge question to start with, and I'm really, really sorry about that. We feel like
You're
we've just
fine.
jumped in straight away because we've got so much to cover today. But if those people in the audience who are financial planners or training to be financial planners or whatever it might be, what advice and tips would you give them on really understanding the impact of psychology and the brain and stuff like that on their clients' financial decisions that they're going to make?
You did start with a big one. Let me start with a story. So that's kind of what I've known for is the financial behavior storyteller. And I think it's always easier to understand these things with a story. I worked for the US military for several years as a contractor. And I remember being in a big meeting. This was on a big military installation. And it was right during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And so a lot of these soldiers had been overseas multiple times. And the military base was tracking the numbers, and there was one thing that was spiking really high more than all the rest of these indicators, and that was financial problems. And I remember being in this meeting with the top head of the base, and he was furious. He wanted an answer, and he slammed his hand down and said, if I have a tank that is broken, then you guys would get out there and you'd fix it. Now, I want you to fix these financial problems. I want you to fix these soldiers, and it's broken and it needs to be fixed right now. And I remember thinking to myself at that time, but these are humans. These aren't tanks, right? And that's the part that I think we have missed so often is the humanity of personal finance. The reason it's called personal financial planning is it's personal. It has to do with you as a human. And so if we start with the human side and not pretend that we're tanks, or in economics that we're rational beings and that rational beings make these decisions, then it helps us understand the more humanity of it. I think it also helps for grace and to be a little more empathetic to what people are going through. Often when I'm teaching courses, I tell my students, we need to get out of the advice giving. No one wants to be, we call it in America, should. No one wants to be should on. You should do this, you should do that, you should do something else. No one wants to be told what to do. And instead, we ought to listen a lot more, ask questions, get to know them. And when I say get to know them, really truly help them discover themselves better. And so these are the things that can really uncover what we call the psychology of money. And the more we uncover their own psychology and help them through the process, the more we can help them on the other side. Because at the end of the day, and I strongly believe this, the expert in the room, if it's you and a client, is the client. The client knows more about their life than we'll ever know or understand. So it's our job to ask the questions and to be present and to do the things that maybe are really uncomfortable for us. Pushing the numbers aside for a minute. Numbers are important in financial planning, but they have their time and their place. And I think conversation, leading with communication and conversation, is really the human side of money to understand the client themselves.
Yeah. Can tell this isn't your first rodeo, Mary, because I love it when you said my favorite quote so far from this episode is when you said, "If we try not to be tanks," like that is
Yep.
we could put that onto a nice, lovely horizon background, couldn't we? And then put underneath philosopher Mary Carlson, because that is just like brilliant. But also, it's kind of what we were talking about a little bit before as well. I was actually talking to Christy Archuleta, who I know that I think she's actually part of the Financial
She
Behaviour Keynote
is.
Group.
She's part of the keynote group. Yep.
And she's coming on, it was actually today, and she's coming on to the podcast in a few weeks' time as well, everybody. So getting excited for that. But, we were talking about how you don't get taught this kind of stuff at school, certainly not at school, but you certainly don't learn it when you're learning or training to become a financial planner, or at least not now. You don't, especially not in the UK. I mean, in the UK, you can pass an exam, which usually takes people around 6 months to a year to get qualified, and then you can start going out and giving financial advice in quotation marks to actual real people. Now, in my opinion, I don't necessarily think that you're ready to give great human financial planning because partially because you haven't actually learned how to understand that human who's across the table from you. And a lot of the time we pick this up through shadowing, so we pick it up through watching other people do it and stuff like that. But it is a real shame that there isn't stuff out there, and I know this is what you're trying to put right, to help people actually understand the real psychology of financial planning and how that actually applies to it, because it's so important.
It is, yeah. And I think that that's also a wide open door for those that are listening and thinking, well, I'm not a financial planner because I don't like numbers or I don't like this and that. We actually, some of the best financial planners come from other fields, come from psychology, come from therapy, come from all these different fields that know a lot about human and human behavior. A lot of what I teach actually in some of the online programs is past military members. They have a lot of world experience, and that can be brought to the table because that's connecting the humanity side. And so I would say to anyone even considering this as a profession, don't discount yourself. Don't discount the experiences that you've had. There's many times I think that people are also fearful of, I've been bad with my money, therefore I couldn't help someone else. And so I think it's a two-pronged thing. I think it's important, one, that you do understand and you get the knowledge for yourself to be able to better your own livelihood. And secondly, I think it's important to have what you were talking about, Dan, and that is that education component. It's really important to not just say, well, I did it this way, so this is the right way, right? And jump out there and say, well, this is the way everyone should do it. That's one of the things that we at Financial Behavior Keynote Group do is we bring what we call evidence-based experience. And when I say evidence-based, that's years of research and training and seeing. In fact, you mentioned apprenticeship. One of my mentors is Christy Archuleta, and learning from the great minds to be able to understand the human side of money and human behavior and understand the financial part, because we can do damage in the long run if we don't understand both of those sides. And so it's really important that you do take your certifications, that you really understand what you're talking about and what you're helping people with. It's also really important to understand the people themselves and what they need and want.
I mean, that's definitely the part where we can actually get people to do things. You do things based on, like you said, you don't do things based on should. You do things based on could. You do things based on you could do this, or you can do this, or something like that. It's much more empowering to be told you could do something rather than being told that you should do something. Definitely.
Well, and let me jump in there too. It's even more powerful. Like there's the good, better, best. That's good. The better and even best one would be the client deciding that for themselves.
Yeah.
So one of the best ways to find out what clients are willing to do and wanting to do and make the changes in their own life is asking them. And those are the questions that we talk about in our group, that we ask and say, so talk to me, what have you done in the past that's helped you through whatever the issue is, right? And then it gets the client thinking and saying, you know, I've dealt with this before. These are some things that worked for me before. And then that helps advance them. This is the psychology part that's really important, is we are so used to telling people and instead asking good questions. One of the things that's really important is not just asking the question, but then listening. We sometimes jump in and interrupt someone because we've got the next thing on our mind, but sitting back and fully listening and even utilizing this lovely thing that we're very uncomfortable with, and that is silence. And silence can be a great tool. All of these are just as important to know and understand and utilize as a retirement cash flow or an insurance or investment product. So all of these human components are vital to helping you further the client and the client furthering themselves, because at the end of the day, this is the client's life. And the client's going to do what they want to do, no matter how many wonderful little bullet points you put up or how many spreadsheets you make. And so in getting them involved with the process and finding out what they're willing to do and change is really the key to advancing the client.
Yeah, it is. And it's applicable with examples as well. Like I used to work in a financial planning business. The feedback that we used to get from clients, the glowing feedback, was never, oh, they helped me, put my money into the right investment, or put my money into the right fund, or whatever it might be. It was always, almost always, nearly always, every time, they listened to me, or they understood me, or they made me feel comfortable, or they made me feel relaxed, or anything like that. Nothing at all to do with any of the tools that financial planners use. It was always the emotions of how you made someone feel. And that is the part where, if we're thinking about it from a business perspective, purely business perspective, you're going to get referrals from people who feel emotional about you, because emotions drive our decisions. And right investment decisions or right money decisions or whatever, they don't drive referrals, but emotions do, definitely.
Absolutely. And let me share one of my favorite quotes of all time. It's Maya Angelou, who says, a person may forget what you said, they may forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And so that emotional side is the part that's really going to stick with that client. And if you help the client feel heard and feel listened to, there you go. You've already won. That's the most important.
Completely. I was leaving a period of silence there because I'm trying to train myself to be better at that.
It does take training. It's hard.
Definitely does. I mean, I've done 100 episodes of the NextGen podcast now, and you're still learning how to do these kind of things. But that ties me quite nicely on the emotions bit to what I really want to talk about, which is something that you specialize in, which is the area of stress around money and that kind of stuff. Like, I mean, it's a Western thing, isn't it, that stress is normally shown in the studies to be the number one cause of stress for people. And it's a bit weird because in our profession, we usually work with people who have comfortable amounts of money, or maybe sometimes too much money, or well, if that could even be a thing. We know it can be a thing,
Yeah.
and the stress levels don't get any different throughout. It's just a different type of situation which has caused the stress. The stress levels usually stay pretty much the same. So when, again, this is another massive question. I'm so sorry for this, Mary, but like for the people in the audience again, how do you get into their minds of remembering that the person across from them is likely to be very stressed about their money and their finances? Like, what kind of things do you usually talk to people about to help them understand how stressed those people are?
Well, there's so many ways to go with this. Let me start by kind of stepping back for a minute. Let's keep in mind that money, however it's defined, is really a resource, and it's a finite resource. You may be Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk and have a lot, but it also has an end to it. You may be someone who's in poverty that has a more tangible, finite end of its resource. And so I want to be careful here because often we think, or there's a misconception that it's just people at the bottom end of the spectrum that have very little money are the one with the money problems. And we know, Dan, that to be not true. Anyone that's worked with someone that has money on any sort of that spectrum knows that it can also inhibit problems. But let's keep in mind, we often blame money, but money is not a person, it's a thing, it's a resource. And so, what we need to peel back and understand better is what's the emotion behind the money that's driving the behavior or the negative feelings or the mental shift that needs to take place. And that's what I think is most important when trying to understand a behavior of a client that doesn't seem to reconcile with what you want them to do, is really pulling back and trying to understand. One of my favorite ways of doing this is something called the money history. And that is just asking a couple of questions I really like to ask are, what's your first money memory? And then listening to where those take you, what their experiences and memories are. Another one I like to ask is, what does money smell like to you? And this one throws people off, but I've had everything from cattle, and those are from people who live on ranches and their livelihood comes from livestock. I've had oil and gas. I grew up in an area of West Texas where that was how money was made, is through oil and gas. I personally think money stinks. And the reason why, I was a bank teller and I've touched and felt the stuff, and it's disgusting, quite honestly. And so it's interesting to hear the various experiences that people have. And I'm talking about the emotional, how it smells, how it feels, how you think about it, how you react to it. There's been some very powerful insights when we start talking about the money history questions of, how did you grow up? Did your parents talk about money? How did you first learn about money? When you start asking those types of questions, it takes them back to childhood. And our very earliest money memories are formed in childhood. I'll use myself as an example and my poor husband, who always gets thrown in here. But I grew up in a very middle income childhood. I never remember really wanting for anything. We were definitely not rich. In fact, I remember my parents saying their first Christmas together, they gave each other a case of green beans and a case of corn. That's how poor they were. But at least they had the money for food, right? But I never remember going to bed hungry or being without. But we definitely didn't have all the luxuries. Now, on the opposite end of that spectrum, my husband vividly remembers as a child um, going without food, having no home to live in, sleeping in his car with his parent. He remembers going into a store with $5, which in the US, that is not much money, even 20, 30 years ago. And he remembers being told by his dad, "Hey, son, we've only got $5 to eat on the entire week." And it was him and his dad. And that's all the money they ever had. Now, what's interesting about his behavior now, and he's 40 years old, I'm really ratting him out on here, aren't I? Um, but at 40 years old, what's so interesting is I can send him to the store with a list and he will stick to that list, or with a budget. I'll say, don't spend more than $200 or whatever the case may be. And he will stick to it like glue. He does not deviate. Now, I walk into a store and I start pulling things off the shelves and thinking we can, and I've always doubled, if not tripled, the budget. But I think that's so interesting because for him, he remembers as a child going in the store. So he never, growing up, asked for all of the items, on the front shelves by the cash register that they try to get the little kids
Yeah.
begging parents for. He never asked for those because he understood at a very young age, they didn't have money for that. And I think that's fascinating how that has played 40 years later into even his spending habits now. And it's taken some time, overtime, for me to say, it's okay. You can buy yourself something. You have some money. It's okay. But it's taken a long time, over a decade of us working together to get him to a place that he even feels comfortable buying himself something because those habits were formed so early. So I say all of that because it's not just money is stressful. Money is stressful for a lot of reasons. It's not just we don't have enough of it, because plenty of studies have shown that only up to a certain amount, yes, money can be stressful if you don't have enough, but at some amount, it doesn't make you any happier. And so that's the key part of really understanding your background and your spouse's background and your family. How are you going to teach your kids about this? Because this has generational effects that will not just affect you, but will continue to affect those that come after you for a long time. And that's where, when I hear stress, it's yes, I feel stressed about money because a recession or inflation is high or COVID's happened or whatever the case may be. But there's usually an underlying cause for that. One more thought on this, and then we can move on. But I remember vividly my grandmother grew up in the Great Depression. And for any of you that still have grandparents or did have grandparents and remember those memories, she would cut the corners off of the cheese when it got moldy and continue to eat the cheese. She would scoop this off the top of the yogurt if it was starting to go moldy and continue to use it. I mean, she reused food, clothes, so many things that I would have quickly just discarded and thrown out because she lived through that time period. And so those are very formative things that can happen as a society, as an individual, as a family, that really impact. I mean, she lived to be in her 90s before she passed away and was still doing that, even though she was a young child when the Great Depression happened.
Yeah.
So just keep in mind those things that you're seeing could definitely be a talking point for really understanding what's going on behind the scenes, and quite honestly could have been happening for generations inside a family.
Yeah. You're such a brilliant storyteller, Mary. I can see why that is, why you've gained that nick, or that kind of suffix to your name, is because it's so true. What you just said kind of really does show the power of habits and how impactful they actually are on people's lives, because those are all habits, what you just mentioned there, aren't they, of the cutting off the cheese and the yogurt and that kind of stuff. And it's something I've talked about in the past, is, it'd be really interesting to see in 20-30 years time, or even in a shorter time frame, the impacts of the recent few years of the coronavirus and the kind of the global economic crisis and all that kind of stuff, how that actually impacts future generations in terms of their habits around money, their habits around health, lifestyle, all those kind of things. And it all ties into these conversations that are going to be happening in the future at some point. And
absolutely,
it's going to be fascinating. If we could kind of just come back to behavioral finance in our profession for a little bit. I know that everything we're talking about today is going to be behavioral, but we've kind of touched on it a little bit. But like we said, this is if we went back 20 years and started talking about this to a financial advisor in the 2000s or the 1990s, they'd look at us and they'd go, "What on earth are you? What is all this wishy-washy emotional nonsense that you're talking about here?" And in a way, I'm actually quite happy with that. That proves how much we've moved on. It really does, in my opinion. But what do you think? Like, how far do you think this has shown that our profession or our we've still got a long way to go, obviously, but how far do you think this has actually shown that we've grown up a little bit as a profession and we're starting to go in the right direction?
I have a good friend, Michael Thomas, who's also a member of Financial Behavior Keynote. And Michael gave a talk back in, I believe it was 2015, and it was called, and I hope I get this right, it's Financial and Emotional Compassion. So, financial compassion and empathy. And he really hones in. It's a fantastic 10-minute TED talk. Totally should watch it. I remember, though, he said he gave that talk and almost no one responded back. They're like, oh, yeah, nice, good job, TED Talk. And then a few years passed, and he said it took about 5 years right after COVID or right around COVID period that this just started to take off. And all of a sudden, he started getting phone calls like crazy. The TED Talk has taken off in a lot of ways. And I just laughed because I remember thinking a lot of people would say, oh, yeah, the soft, I don't like this word, but they call it the soft side of money, and just kind of poo-poo it and push it to the side. But really, where we're at now is really knowing this emotional intelligence side of money is vital to understanding. We can only force a horse to go so far. We can only force humans to go so far before at some point they push back and they say, I'm not willing to do this. And so understanding that psychology of it is vital. And so I just look at Michael's speech and think about how we've just advanced, quite honestly, in 5-10 year time frame to this. And I hope this continues to be so. Obviously, the CFP, Board Certified Financial Planner Board of Standards, has recently introduced financial psychology into the test for CFPs. It is a big component. It's continuing to raise awareness around financial psychology. So I think we're going to continue. I think this isn't just a trend like in the 80s when you'd have your hair tie-dyed. But I think this is going to be something that's here to stay and not just a trend that's going to fade out, because we really work with people at the end of the day. That's what financial planning is all about. If we didn't work with people, you're right, we wouldn't need this stuff. We could go back to our spreadsheets and start working on crunching numbers. But because we work with people and people are always changing, then we need to understand humans and human behavior more and more.
Yeah. Definitely. And I think it's really important to kind of to realize and to kind of pay homage to the people who have. I've spoken about this recently with someone called Lauren Stansel, who was on our podcast, and she said we should really show admiration to the people who have put in the work in the previous years to make this happen. So, for instance, people like Dick Wagner, for instance, in the United States, he was massive on this kind of stuff. Amy Mullen and the team at Money Quotient, I know that they're doing amazing work in the US and things like that. It is important to recognize that these people have made sure that we're talking about this today because of the amazing work that they've been doing in the previous years and all the tools and stuff that are available out there. Sorry, my phone's ringing, by the way. Carry on, Mary.
All good. Well, and that's one of the things too, is I would definitely appreciate the past, because there's so many seminal articles about the art of financial planning, the research of financial planning, all of those there were 4 of them that are very seminal that talked about this 20 years ago. But what's even more important now is that it's not just, I feel like for a while, it was just a few of us in a small room together. If you know about the Financial Therapy Association, they very much have been talking about this for over a decade plus now. And so it's been being talked about. It just hasn't been dispersed into as many circles. And that's what I'm so excited about, is that, yes, those pioneers have started and paved the path. And we need more that are like you, gleaning onto this and continuing to carry that, because it can't just stop with the Dick Wagners of the world. It's got to continue to evolve, right? And to change and to become a standard practice in the industry.
Yeah. The good thing is that the echo chambers that and we call them echo chambers. That sounds like a bit of a bad term, but the NextGen community, for instance, when I think of the people in there, 1,000 of people in there, almost all of them I could point at and say they are focusing on this kind of stuff properly, and they're not doing what we would have said 20 years ago, 30 years ago financial advice would have looked like. So it definitely does exist, but I agree with you, we need to kind of keep that conversation and keep that spread going, definitely. again, it's just another huge question. I feel so bad for putting all these off like massive questions in. And we've kind of touched on elements of it, like listening and asking great questions and stuff like that. But
Mhm.
when you're working with financial planners to help them get better at this stuff, what are kind of some of the main things that you work on in terms of behavioral finance and behavioral traits and stuff like that? Like, what are the main signposts of how to get better at this kind of stuff that may not be natural to financial planners when they're doing their day job?
Well, Dan, I'm smiling because we're talking about the forerunners who, came maybe 20, 30, maybe 40 years ago if we push it. But if we go over to psychology, they're laughing because they're like, we have been doing this for hundreds of years and you guys are just now catching on.
Yeah.
So what's great about this is though is that we have hundreds of years of data and research and real scientists that have created, and this is not just our field, it's being utilized in multiple fields, and so we're just catching the wave of this, and that's what I think is so very exciting. Now, how do I utilize this in my practice? Let's go specifically to a question that you asked earlier, and that is around behavioral economics. So we've all heard the term. It sounds really interesting. You may have read a few books here or there, and the Richard Thaler's of the world are fantastic. But at the end of the day, you're like, how do I break this down and apply it to my practice? And I just put out a book this last year that does just that because I was in the same boat. Like, I like this concept. I have no idea how to actually apply it. So it starts with a couple of things. And I think number one is understanding the brain. And when we understand how our brain works, even at a very high level, I don't pretend that we're training neurosurgeons here. But if you understand the components of the brain, really, there's kind of the frontal cortex and then what we call the emotional or the limbic system that kind of work together. And in that, you had mentioned earlier, a lot of decisions are based on emotion. Well, because that's the side of our brain that fires quickly. It also includes the fight or flight. It has to fire quickly because that's what's going to get you out of danger. And so when we make initial kind of those gut initial decisions, it's usually the back third of our brain that's the emotional side of our brain. The frontal cortex, where it works, but it takes longer to fire up, and it's more strategic thinking. It's more analytical. So if you're thinking in the Star Trek world, this is more the Spock-like part of your brain versus the backside, which is more the Bart Simpson part of the brain. And so as you're using the Spock-like part of your brain, it takes longer, which is why it's important to pause, which is why it's important to have silence, because it's taking longer to fire in that area. If you want a quick answer, then you're just going to get that emotional answer. It also is going to matter how you ask the question. Do you like ice cream? Yes or no? Right? That doesn't give me much information. Yes, I like ice cream. Great. I don't know what flavor you like. I don't know what type you like. The more important thing is asking, talk to me about your favorite dessert. What would that be for you? Same question, but asked in a very different way that really allows them to open up and start sharing more. And in this case, it's dessert, but sharing more of who they are and what they like. So just asking a question is not good enough. It's asking the right question at the right time. Because the way in which we ask the question is also going to play out on the response or the answers that I give. Sometimes the client will come into your office and they will have just had a fight with their spouse in the car. Now, you won't know this, but already tensions are high, they're stressed, and they're walking in, and then you start talking to them. Maybe one tunes out and the other one just wants to fight you on everything. You have no idea what's going on. You're thinking, was this me? Did I say something wrong? No, it had nothing to do with you. It had to do with all the emotions that were brought into the room before. But again, those are great examples of slowing down, asking questions, allowing for them to think and process. And sometimes that means think and processing about the fight they just had to get through that so they can think about what you're asking them. Those are the moments that really allow for them to utilize that frontal cortex of the brain. So I think that it's really important to understand at a very base level how we function as humans. And that's where the psychology really comes in, is understanding the theory. So there's a lot of theory in psychology, not so much in financial planning, but we borrow from that. That's exactly what economics did. Economics had theory, but it was all about rational man. If you look at Adam Smith, it's humans make rational decisions. Well, we know that's not the case. So when you start mixing economics and mixing it in with psychology, you get behavioral economics. And that is the study of how humans behave around economic principles. Behavioral finance is actually the study of how humans behave in a market system. And so think of the stock market. That's how we behave and understand in that system. So those, I think, are really important concepts to glean from before jumping in to start to ask the questions. One more thought, and this kind of came from an earlier question, is you said, we get stuck in habits and we do the same things. Well, that goes back to psychology. Our brains are triggered to go to the path of least resistance. And so, what we call that in behavioral economics is we've all got cognitive biases, which are just naturally occurring things that we can't change, but we use something called heuristics. And heuristics is exactly what you said, Dan. That's a shortcut to get over that hurdle or that bias that we may have. And so knowing that can help you utilize the heuristics or the shortcuts to get to the client to a better spot. So the more you understand about the brain and humans, the more you're going to understand how to help the client.
Look at the smile on your face when you
into you, and you're like, okay, let's see how this works. it's getting to that frontal cortex. I see it working now.
So for anyone who's listening, by the way, you won't be able to see the gleaming smile on Mary's face when she's talking, but like this is what you can tell. Like this is what switches Mary on straight away because she's absolutely gleaming when she's talking about it. I generally don't know where to start with all of that kind of stuff because the questions bit is, I think, some of the most powerful things that we can bring into our profession is, and there's already people out there who understand how to ask really great questions. Like for instance, we've had workshops with George Kinder in our community before, and someone on that workshop came up with one that George had never even heard of before. And you think George Kinder had probably heard every financial planning question under the sun, and it was, what does a bad retirement look like for you based on what you've seen in the past? What does a bad retirement look like for you? And he was shell-shocked. He was like, I've never thought about it, framing it in that way before. And also things like anti-goals, for instance, they're coming up a lot recently in terms of asking people what they don't want to happen in the future rather than what they want to happen in the future, because we are risk averse animals and we'll probably understand more about what we don't want to happen than what we do want to happen. And even just again framing that question in a different way rather than just going out there like you said and saying what's your favorite this, you say, okay, well what really don't you want to happen, or what's your least favorite, or something like that. It's much more powerful, and it's so much more kind of, it looks and feels more like a profession when we ask questions like that rather than just a service or an industry. It definitely does.
And it's a true skill. Like you don't just wake up one day and start asking questions or start asking questions at all. It's a skill you have to practice over and over and over again. One of the experts on financial behavior keynote group is Ryan Law. He's actually giving one on the power of questions and what questions to ask and communication and how to ask those. So I want you to know that I don't expect each of you to walk away from this podcast or this video today and go, I have the answer. I'm going to start asking all these great questions, but start becoming aware. Just the fact that you're listening and that you're hearing this and you're thinking, maybe I could ask better questions. That's actually the very first start. We call that contemplation in the trans-theoretical model stages of change. That very first thought of, I might be able to ask better questions, can eventually get us over to the action phase. We like to think as planners, all of our clients walk through the door in what we call the action phase of financial planning. To be honest, research has shown only 20% of clients are actually ready to take action. And so that leaves the 80% kind of out in this universe of somewhere between pre-contemplation, contemplation, maintenance, somewhere kind of lost in the shuffle, but we're throwing them advice as if they're ready to take action and they're not. And so I'm using this example of if you're thinking even about asking better questions, you're heading in the right direction. Start gaining the skills and reaching out and coming to workshops and understanding how to ask better questions, because that's going to take some practice and move you into that action phase to where you can start asking these questions very naturally. And
Yeah.
the same goes for our clients, being aware that they may not be ready to implement the 3-page long to-do list that you have for them, but taking it a few steps at a time. And if they're not ready to take action on that, it's okay. Ask them where they are ready and what maybe they're ready to start changing today. And it may be something that's not even on your list. And that's okay, because that's where they're at. And so it's meeting the client where they are, not forcing them to get where we think they should be.
Yeah. I want to explore something a little bit that you were talking about, which actually forgot to mention in my last little preamble that I was talking about. There is, you mentioned that the mindset of people when they come in to see financial planners, and George Kinder talked about this as well, about like how they could be probably in the car and on the way to the meeting with a financial planner. All sorts of things are going through their head. Like you said, they've probably might have had an argument with their partner or whatever it is. So if you get that feeling from a client, or you get the feeling that they are not ready or not in the right mindset, what advice do you usually give people to actually how to get clients in the right mindset, or how to deal with that situation of them not being in the right mindset?
You ask. And that's really, it's that simple of if you realize that whatever you're communicating is falling off, then you just stop for a minute and say, let's talk. What's going on in your world right now? It could have been a death of a loved one that they're really struggling mourning through, right? And you feel like, hey, they should be ready to go on, but maybe they're not. It could be some things. So that's where I think you opening up and ask and saying, what's happening in your space? How can we be of service to you? Where can we help engage? And what are you wanting to talk about today? Because they may not want to talk about anything that you've prepared. Maybe they want to talk about the fight in the car. And if it is, you simply listen and reflect. That's all that most people need. They don't need us to fix their problems. In fact, that's usually the worst thing you can do.
Yeah.
They have the solutions within themselves to fix it. They just need to feel heard. They need to feel listened to. And so by you asking and saying, help me understand where you're at today, what's going on? How can we help? Those simple questions can really help the client feel the one, that they're in a safe place to share, and two, that they're not being judged or forced into something that they don't want to do or don't want to be in. And it allows them to really express what's going on behind. Let's pretend that they had a fight with one of their children and they're looking to write them out of their inheritance. That's a huge financial planning decision, right? But you may never know that until they just call you up one day and say, cut this person. But if you start to understand those things behind it, then you can also help them. I would also caution financial planners right here, because this can seem very heavy to financial planners. I remember vividly one time a financial planner coming to me and saying, I didn't know what to do. The client just started to cry in my office. So I handed him a box of Kleenex. And that, while that is good, I definitely recommend that and listening, it can also be really uncomfortable. And so I want you to kind of work through that. Why does that make you uncomfortable? Asking yourself those questions and maybe understanding more. The second part is you need to know when this has exceeded your expertise. So I am not telling anyone here to become a therapist or pretend to be a therapist in a client session. What I am saying is be okay with emotion and learning to ask questions and have emotions come out. That is fine. That doesn't need therapy. But also know at a point, and I can give you a couple of examples. I remember vividly there was a client that had cash flow of $500,000 a year, which is a lot of money. And yet they were outspending their assets faster than they were bringing them in. And so one of the problems is we started to really pull back, I call it the layers of the onion, right? As you start to peel back those layers, come to find out there were some massive marital issues, which further were stemmed by some anger management issues with one spouse in particular. And I was in a place that I finally was able to tell that spouse and say, hey, I can only progress you so far on the financial side until you're able to get help with the anger management issue, because that was the central cause and the root of so many problems. Now, granted, there's layers within that root too that he needed to discover, but anger management was not my specialty and I could not take the client there. So I had to refer out. So that's really important to know when you need to refer out. I worked with the government for a while, and we would sometimes get cases which we called the trifecta. So it would be someone who is an alcoholic. They would have financial problems, and usually that came with marital issues as well. And many times I would try to send this person to me to fix the financial issue or the gambling issue or whatever the financial issue may be. I learned very quickly I could not take on the financial issue until the alcoholism was addressed, because that addiction was penetrating so many facets of their life that it was just, I was running on a treadmill, getting nowhere with them on the financial side because the alcoholism wasn't addressed. So I worked with a social worker, I worked with a marriage and family therapist, and then there was me. So we would use all three connections to be able to help advance the person at the right stage and phase. Often what would happen is they would work with a social worker and get into a rehab program. And once they've processed, which can be a long time, 3 to 6 months or longer, but once they work through that rehab program, then we brought them in and they would work with the marriage and family therapist, and they would work with me on the financial matters. So sometimes it takes a long time to process through these. And so being patient, but also knowing like this is where my expertise ends, and this is when I need to have in the old days, we called it the Rolodex, but essentially the referrals to know a mental health therapist, to know a psychologist, to know and work with a social worker. In fact, those can be some of your best sources for referrals back, because once they've worked with a therapist, they are ready to come to you. And the therapist knows often nothing about money. And so it's a real win in many ways, but you're able to help in your area because we don't want to penetrate those boundaries and start helping in areas that we are not trained in. That can be very dangerous.
Yeah. It's great advice. I've never ever thought about that being a professional connection that financial planners could explore. In that kind of network of people that they work with, we always rush to accountants and solicitors or lawyers or whatever it is. And don't get me wrong, they're great, but yeah, you can definitely kind of branch out a little bit more and start to. I mean, it depends on if you want to actually work with the people that the therapists work with as well, for instance. But yeah, I never thought about that before. It's really, really useful advice.
Well, and this even adds in, sorry, Dan, one more thought on that though, is this even adds into money issues in a family. And let's be honest, we've seen that as it passes from generation, inheritances are passed down, the fighting and some of the problems that come from that. A mediator could be a great person to have on your files, right? And to have a relationship with, because mediators are specifically trained in conflict resolution. And I guarantee if you have not experienced conflict in a financial planning setting, you will. So it's good to have those things in reference. It may not be a mental health therapist. It may just need the resource of a mediator or something along the way. But those are fantastic referrals to be able to get some help with.
No, they definitely are. Yeah. Never thought about that before. Really, really cool. Another thing that you work with, Mary, and we're getting close to taking up too much of your time today, so we'll deal with this one quickly, and then we'll rush on to the questions at the end that we ask everyone. But something else you work on, which I think is a crucial part of financial planning nowadays, is the authenticity and building that authenticity with clients. So, again, what kind of things do you work on with financial planners on how to be more authentic and how to build that kind of authenticity with their clients?
Absolutely. I think it starts honestly with environment. And you can see here, I obviously have children over in the backside. You don't see my degrees on the wall. It's a comfortable setting. To me, this is authentic. This is my space and it's a comfortable space. And I think that's one of the things sometimes we do as financial planners is we have the mahogany desk, we have all of our very fancy certifications behind us, and I've even seen like bodybuilder statues or things that people are like don't relate to, right? And it's really meant to show how smart we are. And so if you reverse that and just want people to be comfortable in a space. And so take away the desk, take away the barriers that are inhibiting you in the conversation. Pull in a couch, pull in something that speaks and says, hey, this is who I am. I want to get to know you a little more. One thing I would recommend to anybody that does virtual meetings, get rid of that fuzzy screen in the background, especially if you're a financial planner. And here's why. I don't know what's behind you. And I am not wanting to share not only my financial information, but all of the emotional information we just talked about if I don't have a clue where you're at and who's listening in. And so I think it's really important for financial planners to show that in their environment, show authenticity as well as in who you are. And when I say be authentic, it's not talking over the client, it's actually being what we call it in therapy, is calling it congruent so that you're on the same level. You're not smarter than the client. You may know more about finances than the client, but at the end of the day, what you are is congruent with the client. You're a team working together, not I'm here to tell you what to do or teach you and tell you what you're doing wrong, if which is even worse, right? But instead, let's partner together to move forward. To me, that is true authenticity and really showing how you can help, but really understanding the client. Because when you're authentic, it allows the client to be authentic in return. And that's
Yeah.
the key. That's what you want.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree with the Zoom backgrounds as well. By the way, I mean we're both blessed with quite nice backgrounds, but usually, people. I'll say to people, oh, well, I've said to people, to clients, for instance, why is your background blurred? And say, oh, I've just got my exercise bike in the back corner, and that
Great.
I wouldn't blur unless you've got something really offensive on the wall behind you, which is like the picture of some dictator or something like that, then I would probably understand the blurring. But if it's just your clothes rail or something like that, then that is, I agree with you, that builds authenticity rather than taking it away, which
Well, Dan,
is
and it's so easy to fix. You just simply turn the camera. So if you do have an offensive picture, put it on a different wall, right?
yeah,
Or turn your camera where no one can see it.
yeah.
There's simple
I
things.
think yeah, I think as well something that you kind of you touched on is the vulnerability piece. So this is
Mm,
something that worked massively with a lot of people who we have in our community is to show clients that you mentioned a bit before, that you're talking to a human being, and people resonate with that human like people don't want to feel like you are cleverer than them, or what, like you said, to get on the same level as them. Vulnerability can be a massive way to get there, by saying I've made these mistakes in the past, or I've done this as well, or maybe not talking too much about yourself, because rapport is not the same as talking about yourself all the time. Like there's two different things. But being on the same level as someone by saying I've also done this, or I feel the same sometimes, or whatever, that massively helps towards authenticity as well.
I actually give a presentation on this called The Psychology of Money. And the whole topic is spin around this art concept, which is helping people access, be relatable, and connecting with the client. So this comes from therapy. And at the end of the day, it's a guy named Carl Rogers from the 1950s who said the biggest indicator of change in a therapeutic setting is the relationship between the client and the therapist. I would argue that is true for us as financial planners. The greatest indicator of change for your clients is your relationship with that client. That is what's going to indicate change. And so the more authentic we are and the more relatable and the less we talk, quite honestly, it's talking less about yourself
Yeah.
and listening more. That's going to help the client change.
Yeah, definitely. Good stuff. Well, there's a couple of questions I ask everyone. I'm going to see if we can
Great.
get through them in the next 5 minutes. If not, we might have to run over the hour, but I'm fine talking to you for more than an hour anyways. I hope that you are. if we could think about, so I often think, well, ask people this question of thinking, we talked a little bit about this before. If we could think back 10 years of our profession to 20, oh my God, 2013. I can't believe how fast time's going. But think back to 2013. I wasn't in financial planning then, so I don't know what it was like.
Mm.
But I think you were, and you will know what it was like. But if we could think about the next 10 years, so think 10 years in advance of where we are now, what are you like really excited to see? What would mark a successful 10 years for financial planning, do you think?
So it is hard for me to forecast. What I like to do is hope. Here's what I hope for in the next
Hmm.
10 years. And in many ways, I hope to see many more people that look like the clients they serve. And that can be in gender, in ethnicity, it can be in so many ways. But I feel like this profession is wide open for so many individuals. And there's such a need for moms like me that are staying home with their kids to realize, hey, I can also do this. I can help other people and be with my kids, right? Or someone who maybe, my good friend Michael Thomas works with Black men. We don't see enough Black financial advisors. So my hope is that we continue to help the people that in the communities, because what that's going to do is we continue to grow advisors in this space, that's only going to help more of the population. One of the things I love in my class is I don't just teach those that are wanting to be wealth advisors. I high five you if that is what you're wanting to do, is help the top 3%. Good job. There's the rest of what I call the bell curve, the 80%, and that's everyone else, right? And so I'm hoping that we get more out to the middle and to the lower class in terms of financial planning. They need as much help as different types of help, but as much help as the high net worth. And so keeping those in mind, I think the more we diversify the profession, the more we're going to be diversified in the clients we serve and the more people we can help at the end of the day. That's what I'm really excited for, is being able to take it beyond the rich and take it to the mainstream where people need it.
I definitely share your excitement, and I think the thing for us to remember is something that I think Alan Moore said at one of our conferences once, which is that financial planning for those audiences, as in people from lower income backgrounds or different backgrounds to the usual wealth management industry, whatever we want to call it, background, is that this is not financial planning light. It's not
Mm.
financial planning with bits taken away. It's financial planning but different. That's all it is. It's not light, it's not cheaper, it's not whatever it is. It's just more accessible and it's different. And I think once you start thinking of it that way, all those things of saying, oh well, we tried that in the past but it didn't really work because it wasn't accessible or affordable to these people, all of those problems go away because you've tailored it to the audience that you want to work with. And I share your optimism for that. Definitely do. One kind of, I know we're stuck for time, so the final question that we ask everybody is, if you could recommend a book or a piece of content or something that our audience could consume that's really changed the way that you think about things, what would that be?
That's a hard one. There's a lot, but I will say, if I can squeeze three in, Good to Great. Good to Great is a fantastic book that really shifted. I've talked a lot about good, better, best. Good to Great does that. And it really has shifted my business practices. I think I read it 20, 30 years ago as a grad student. It's one of those long term. The other two that are really vital are also old but goodies. One is Stephen Covey's Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, because the more he did exactly that, he studied psychology and was able to apply it in habits and bring it to the mainstream audience. And I love those habits. And I think we can do that in this space, in our financial planning space. And last but not least is The Millionaire Next Door. And I think that book is although written very technically, it starts to show where true wealth is made. And it's kind of the rag to riches story, but it also breaks through a lot of what we think and we see on Instagram. And that is, oh, rich people do this and rich people wear that or buy that. And The Millionaire Next Door blows all of that up and says, actually, those are not the rich people. those are the ones that are the show-offs, right? The real rich people are the ones in the old overalls driving the old beat up trucks that are saving their money more and more. So those are three that I really have been a transitional fix for me for decades, obviously.
Great stuff. It does say something about the people that we have on the podcast, that everyone breaks the rule of bringing along one book or one something. I don't know why I asked for one, because I know that you're never going to accept that rule, because you've read so many bloody things that have had such a big impact that it's ridiculous asking that. But I mean, they are really useful for our audience. I do actually get comments a lot. People saying, I've heard that book on the NextGen podcast and I read it, and it was life-changing for me as well. So very, very good. A couple of those ones have already been talked about on the podcast, but yeah, it doesn't mean that they're any less influential. Definitely not. So that was really, 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 really good. But we always like to give our guests the last word to say a big thank you for coming on to the show. So can you just tell our audience how to find you, how to connect you, where to find out more about what you do, and if you want to plug anything, then now is your time.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, find me at keynote.financial, www.keynote.financial, or you can find me on LinkedIn. We have a very active community under Mary Bell Carlson or Financial Behavior Keynote Group. You can find us there. And we hope to see several of you in these upcoming webinars, these CEs. So please tap in. Come reach out. All of the things I just talked about are in upcoming CEs. So we hope you join our community. We've got a newsletter that comes out. And Dan, to be honest, we just want to thank you. We love what you're doing over the pond, and we're excited for everything that's happening there and to partner together, because this is not just one country or one place. It really is worldwide. And the more we can share the wealth, the better everyone will be. What is it? Rising boats, rise all tides. That's how we feel about it.
Brilliant. What a nice way to finish with an inspirational quote. Brilliant. That's fantastic. Well, no, thank you so much. And I must say a big thank you to you, Mary, for coming on, because I know that this takes time out of your day that could be spent doing other things, but you agreed to come along and talk to us. So fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. So that was Dr. Mary Bell Carlson from the Financial Behavior Keynote Group on the NextGen Planners podcast. If you enjoy this podcast, we are on all social media platforms, so you can share it with your friends and colleagues, and we are also you can listen to it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and you can watch it nowadays on YouTube as well. And you can find more information about what NextGen get up to at nextgenplanners.co.uk. We'll find out more information about the community full of financial service heroes. In fact, over 1,000 of them now, and they're all coming up with new ideas and sharing best practice between themselves. And we have other things to help you launch your financial planning business or become a financial planner, or whatever it is that you might want to do. We've got something to help you out. And we do have a conference, which hopefully by the time this podcast is released, the conference won't have already been, but it's in May and June this year. And it is a 3-part event. It's going to be a lot of fun. The middle of it is in Manchester, so it'll be a really, really good event. I've got an alarm going off as well, so it probably tells me I should shut up talking, and I'll let everyone get off to their day. So a big thank you once again to Mary for coming on to the podcast. Thank you guys, as always, for listening and watching, and we'll see you all very, very soon. Bye-bye.